Right when this podcast was gathering some steam, I've been on a 2-week unscheduled pause. That is because of this book. It's called Free the Map. It's by Henk Van Houtum, a bordering and geopolitics professor in Holland. Subtitle of the book is From Atlas to Hermes, a new cartography of borders and migration. So, yeah, it sounds interesting. Doesn't sound especially catastrophic, though. This is the third time I have tried to record this episode. The first time was earlier last week, and after I stopped, later on that day, I was utterly exhausted, and I had to lie down. I would have gone to sleep if it hadn't have been for the attention of my 4-year-old daughter. So this is to say that the career I have had and the places that it's taken me have led to significant distress. And this experience backs up why this book was written. There's actually been an accumulation of some motivation for this pause from other episodes. So the one with SIA AI, where Alex Wagner was the guest, there was a discussion I had with that guest after recording ended to provide him with context why that episode about the line was meaningful to me. In turn, he referred me to a podcast called Kabul Falling, and I dutifully listened to the whole thing. I'll share with you now a part of an episode from that, which hit me.
This is what war does to people. Take your inner peace away. Turn you to kind of a robot.
This is what war does to people. Takes your inner peace away, turns you into kind of a robot. When those words came out of Fatima's mouth, this is a guest on this podcast, Kabul Falling, who is now a New York Times journalist. She was caught up in the fall of the American version of Afghanistan and left. When she said that, I felt like my experience had been voiced of what I have been through working in geospatial in Cambodia, Kuwait, and Qatar. This is an illustration of the agency that Fatima has achieved and the resilience that she has demonstrated in the face of such unimaginable war-level trauma that she has been through. She has turned this around and appeared on this podcast and said this, and she has activated me and I expect several other people. I think it's definitely worth celebrating that in this instance, whilst Fatima had such incredible trauma, she has turned around and demonstrated incredible agency in becoming a New York Times journalist and speaking of her experience in this way so that others can perhaps move toward peace. Maybe there's some more she has to say.
If I can say, sometimes you have no emotions, no feelings. Sometimes you are a ball of anger. Sometimes you feel like a ghost, that nobody sees you.
Yeah, so swinging between no emotions and a ball of anger, feeling that nobody understands you. I have been through that, coming back from these, in some ways more chaotic parts of the world to more stable parts of the world and having nobody understand. Earlier in the episode, she also speaks about severe loss of sleep. Once again, I and several others who have taken the path I have can attest to that. Good. So the next quote, if you like, there's going to be a few to start this episode. It's a bit of a provocative one. It's from J.D. Vance, of all people, speaking at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago. You may be wondering what on earth this has to do with anything. But have a listen.
To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership.
I think this is a great launching off point for the third round of quotes from this book, Free the Map. Part 1, The Burden of Atlas, page 30. The result is a portrayal of the world that amounts to a cartographic whitewashing in which all kinds of geopolitical phenomena are de-internationalized. I'll pause there to say, so that's a really vital point throughout this whole book, that the international context for conditions inside countries is removed from our interpretation of the world in a map like this, because one is invited to think that the circumstances inside each of those borders solely explain the conditions inside those borders. So we'll start that sentence again. The result is a portrayal of the world that amounts to a cartographic whitewashing in which all kinds of geopolitical phenomena are de-internationalized and represented against a predetermined jigsaw puzzle-like background of separated containers, key phrase there, defined by continuous borderlines. Since each of these containers is, by default, uniformly colored according to a legend defined by the mapmaker, the resulting political maps always conjure up the illusion of an Earth naturally fragmented into a determined number of irregularly shaped units. It goes on, but I think that's a good flavor for what we're confronted with in this book. So I'm moving on now to page 39, where there's quite a hard-hitting passage. The visa border regime as a remote border control thus first segregates and reifies the world's population into bounded states, then categorizes and essentializes the citizens of these states according to an average characterization, and finally ranks them into a normative hierarchy. The resulting global divide in the freedom to cross borders is what we have conceptualized elsewhere as borderism, by which we mean the discriminatory politics of bordering and othering that essentialize and politicize the value of human beings on the basis of the bordered identities they are born into or are citizen of. As a Nigerian writer has put it, borders don't just keep people out, they define their worth. Put differently, a global aristocracy determined by birth is mirrored by a global underclass whom they lock in from afar while exploiting their labor and resources. This really is a key sentence. I'm going to read it again. Put differently, a global aristocracy determined by birth is mirrored by a global underclass whom they lock in from afar while exploiting their labor and resources. In practice, this implies that a majority of the world's population is territorially trapped in state cages or paper prisons, sentenced by an iniquitous lottery of birth. Paradoxically, the privileged nations of this neo-feudal system, this global apartheid, promote a dominant ideology of liberalism that praises the universal human rights on which the same international system is supposed to be built. Yet the liberal notion of universalism seems to imply a freedom and equality that apply only to people who were lucky enough to be born with the right passport, whenever those born on the wrong side of the border refuse to let their lives be determined by the place in which they were fortuitously born, and thus decide to either migrate or flee, the world of destinations to which they can legally and therefore safely travel is thus far smaller than it would be for someone born on the other side of the border. This severe restriction of legal channels to migrate, affecting most of the world, has literally put a price on freedom. So throughout this part, he offers several reflections on the Fragile States Index, which is this map here. These are like the three horses of the Mercator apocalypse. And this is the Freedom in the World Index, another Mercator-ish style depiction or a choropleth map dividing the world into containers, state containers, and then finally the Corruptions Index, which I happen to know, this is no longer a straight up Mercator projection, but I happen to know that it used to be, when I made a presentation including maps from this, it used to have a Mercator projection in 2019. All right, so picking it up again on page 45, reflecting again on those three maps, the Corruption Perceptions Index, the Freedom in the World Index, and the Fragile States Index. Overall, these borderline maps create a visual distortion of power relations that hide a crucial fact. Many of the countries represented as fragile, unfree, or corrupt are in such dire state because the roguish foreign policies of more powerful countries have contributed in a sustained manner to put them in this precarious condition. So that's about, sort of what I started off with, that this map, falsely, it invites the false impression that what happens inside each container solely explains what happens in each container. So I'll read this again. Overall, these borderline maps create a visual distortion of power relations that hide a crucial fact. Many of the countries represented as fragile, unfree, or corrupt are in such dire state because the roguish foreign policies of more powerful countries have contributed in a sustained manner to put them in this precarious condition. By concealing the history and geopolitical interdependencies, the principle that statist and static maps like these promote is power makes right. As such, these maps essentialize and legitimize the segregationist racism inherent to their iconographic composition. The idea that the benighted countries that fare poorly in their cartographic comparison are of lesser worth, i.e. less developed, third world countries, or as Donald Trump coarsely put it, shithole countries. Powerful countries which fare better in spite of their glimmering internal shortcomings and abundantly researched role in shaping predatory capitalism are, in contrast, absolved of such defects. Therefore, these maps offer no thorough visualizations of the geopolitical phenomena they purport to represent, but instead display a cunning justification of capitalist imperialism, absolved of the rampant global injustices it creates. So we're invited to remove this map that's my background from our attempts to characterize the world, and instead look at power relations and a map that fully characterizes the power dynamics between all these state containers behind me. Recognizing that what goes on outside each of these containers explains what goes on inside them, as well as what happens inside those containers, explaining dynamics inside them. This is the key risk of this map that our profession has provided to the world, and is a key project in the future of our profession to resolve. So then, speaking to this project for our profession, to go from a representation of the world that does not honor the power dynamics explaining a given situation anywhere on the world's surface, to go from only considering the dynamics of power inside a given state container to, along with considering those internal power dynamics, considering those from anywhere outside of that state container. A final quote, a bit of a playful one, from Henk. From Atlas to Hermes. With this perspective in mind, I would suggest that after centuries of following Mercator's and Atlas and deepening, digitizing, and refining it, even to the point of turning it into a carto-hypnotic power system, it is time to finally create a cartographic breakthrough and liberate the chastened Atlas from the heavy burden he has had to represent the world on his own. And who could better help us in this fine task than Hermes, the refined grandson of the overburdened Atlas? Grandpa Atlas would be proud of his grandson. So I think that's enough quotes for now. Maybe it's time for me to say something. You might be wondering why I especially could have been traumatized, considering the color of my skin, my sex, and the passports that I hold, Australian, British, and a US green card. The fact that also I grew up in Australia, I had the benefit of the fantastic education system there, including a master's in applied science, focusing on geographic information systems at the University of Melbourne. Surely the world is my oyster and my enjoyment. Surely any kind of a career, regardless of where I go through it, could not, of all things, lead me to sleepless nights for years, a sense of unending guilt that kills all enjoyment, a sense of never being satisfied with anything, a sense that I cannot truly let something go that, happened in my past and feel partake in any basic hedonism without returning to the conclusion that I don't deserve it. So what this quote from Fatima, these observations in this book from Henk, and my somewhat provocative take on the invitation given the world's democracies by J.D. Vance, what all of these stimuli tell me is that I should speak up about what I have seen on my brief tour from Australia to Cambodia to Kuwait to Qatar to the UK and now to the US. There have been glimpses throughout that experience of the power of speaking up, given that this is not the first time I have spoken up. But I suppose what I'm going to do here is maybe summarize all the speaking up that I have done and do a bit more to round things off. And who knows, maybe put it all behind me. And maybe get to a point personally where the country that I have settled in, the US, is one where I can partake and not be, as Fatima says, a mute, verbally and emotionally, object, eternally operated on by the traumas that I have been through. So I have actually, believe it or not, a bit of a plan. We have done the scene setting. We've done Fatima's quote, Vance's quote, Houtum's quotes. I want to emphasize at the top here that it is a plan for solutions and healing. There are several plans that one might have in response to an experience of trauma. Several plans. One of them, for example, might be revenge, which could take several forms, all of which I, perhaps in a cliched way, would say are counterproductive. But nevertheless, I'm not above saying understandable. But I'm choosing, given that somehow I presently have the emotional and social resources and financial resources to take this approach, I'm saying I have a plan for solutions and healing. So what is the agenda? Essentially, to verify what Henk says about this border map problem and the invitation that this type of map offers to consider each country as being independent in all ways, and that everything that happens in that country is solely caused by actions of the leadership inside the country and down to all the way individual citizens. So what can I offer from my experience that counters this characterization? I will start with Cambodia. I was a Engineers Without Borders Australia funded volunteer in Cambodia 2011 to 2012 at Samakum Ting Tanat, which was or is a local non-government organization advocating on behalf of those in urban poor settlements. The less politically correct term is slums. Their focus was in Phnom Penh, the capital city. What I was confronted with was a country which, as of this year, for the past 33 years of the past 40 years, was a dictatorship under Hun Sen. In the time that I was there, the opposition leader was exiled. He had 100% of parliamentary seats. Usual dictator type things. So how was that circumstance somehow not entirely explained by dynamics internal to the country? Well, he was a member of the Khmer Rouge. This was a genocidal regime around, after the Vietnam War until sort of the mid-80s, at least, almost up to the 90s, which, in its heyday, if I can put it that way, was responsible for killing off a quarter of the population of the country. I've only mentioned that, this was a dictatorship, and, Pol Pot was the leader of that regime. Does all of this, it's sounding like it still all occurs in isolation, but it doesn't, because as pretext for that rule, there was the Vietnam War. And it wasn't just the Vietnam War. It was also the bombing by the US of Laos and Cambodia, along with Vietnam. There we go. So from over essentially a 10-year period from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. This is an animation of millions of bombing sorties during the so-called Vietnam War. You can see at this point, most of the bombs are constrained to Vietnam, but there are some in Laos, and occasionally you'll see them crop up in Cambodia. But as the animation goes through, you will see at one point there is a concentration of bombing in Cambodia. So here is a foreign power violating the border of another country at will, with vastly superior technology than the local population had at its disposal, raining hell upon a population in Southeast Asia, in the 1960s and 70s, which one might imagine didn't necessarily have the educational or technocratic background and view on life to easily explain or understand why these events were happening. And for the discourse about those events to proceed in a way that was entirely, and you can see that the bombs are now dropping heavily on Cambodia, across half the country, really. That where such a population, given its socioeconomic status, education status, one might imagine that discussion and understanding of the reason for that bombing may proceed in a certain way, and that a charismatic leader may be able to develop a narrative and achieve a position of power in leveraging a certain explanation of these events, or at least to capitalize on the terror, perhaps in a way that without the emotions that this bombing might cause, outcomes may have been different, and endorsement of the leader may have been different. So what ended up happening was, as the sum of all of these inputs, this dictatorial regime emerged. It became genocidal. The rich and powerful within that country, especially the more educated people, those with glasses, were essentially packed off to the killing fields and, shot and left with bodies in the fields. This was the result of this intervention from a foreign power within this country container, Cambodia. So, then that's item A, explaining, this dictator in this country that I went to. And, conditions haven't really improved massively over the years, since this bombing of this country, and then the initial horrific dictator, Pol Pot, and then, the more longer term one, who was also part of the Khmer Rouge, Hun Sen. Not a lot has been achieved for the people under their rule since, this point in time that I am choosing of this intervention, this transgression of their borders by the US, to, at least as it was perceived by a portion of the population, this indiscriminate bombing of them. So a way to express how conditions, over the decades of Hun Sen's leadership didn't improve especially much for the average person. there was an accumulation of these urban poor settlements across Phnom Penh, the capital city. And one might say, you know, as actually an effort to improve conditions, there were efforts to, there were urban renewal and urban development efforts. And as part of those, the government sought to clear out these urban poor settlements. But if this sort of thing had happened in Australia, for example, there would have been a fair compensation process with the courts firmly at the center of how much compensation to offer those whose land was being taken, and the threat of significant news coverage if the government chose to conduct themselves in a way in a cavalier way. But what occurred in Cambodia was, and there's many examples, but one I'm going to choose actually involves the Australian government. So similar to the recently disbanded USAID, there's AusAid, Australia's foreign aid, you know, soft power department, I guess. So they were assisting the Cambodian government to rehabilitate their railways because they had sat abandoned for decades as part of the destruction of the country by the Khmer Rouge. And because those railway easements were going through the capital city, and it meant that there was a lot of land that was available for these urban poor settlements to spring up along. And, you know, because AusAid was involved, you know, they tried to, or it looked like they tried to treat these settlements with respect and laid out a plan in writing for how they should be compensated. So what Samakong Ting Tanaut, this local NGO that I was volunteering with, did was went and interviewed several of the people living along these railway easements in these settlements being cleared out, and checked if the right calculations had been made and the right compensation had been offered to these people. And they found systematic undercompensation. Again, on this project funded by the Australian government in concert with the Cambodian government. And this obviously really annoyed the Cambodian government. And as a result, they suspended the license for this NGO for 5 months. So this was the start of my placement. And it was actually delayed by 2 months. And as a result, it was only a 10-month rather than a 12-month placement. It was delayed by 2 months whilst Engineers Without Borders Australia reviewed the safety of me being deployed there. I realize I don't need to share my screen whilst I talk about this. So when I arrived, they flouted the ban and were offered an office in Licardo's building. This is a French-Canadian NGO. So the whole of the staff for Samakong Ting Tanaut was sat in this, you know, office on the second floor of Licardo for 5 months until the ban was lifted, and then we went to our own office building in the south of the city. But you know, so just to again, this is another instance where there's an involvement of another country, Australia, in the internal affairs of this other country. And that is not to accuse the Australian government of participating in this undercompensation. Nevertheless, they were associated with this project, and this NGO found evidence of this abuse, which the project supposedly set out to avoid. So that's one example from my experience there. Another example I will relate, and it is because I want to speak to the trauma that Fatima, in a far more compelling Wei speaks of, because she went through a war. I did not. Nevertheless, an example of the trauma that I experienced in Cambodia was coming upon a head-on collision between two buses. One way that I tried to get away from it all when I was there was to go on lots of motorbike trips around the country. And yeah, with two others, I was on a motorbike trip to the Vietnam border, so towards the east. And yeah, there was a traffic jam, and it was in rural Cambodia, so it was unanticipated. We filtered towards the front of it and came upon this scene of destruction. I had heard horrific stories about foreigners who had tried to help out when there were accidents like this, and there being misunderstandings and, somehow perceived disrespect toward the locals by those seeking to help out, and actually people being lynched. So I was quite reluctant to get involved, and I rode past the scene of the accident a bit, and we obviously stopped, but I was, hesitant. Another man that was riding with me was a Sikh. He was from a rich banking family in India, and as a great example of the kind of good that Sikhs do in the world, this man wasn't necessarily leveraging his privilege and his background coming from a banking family to enjoy the spoils of the world, but was instead working on behalf of those less fortunate by volunteering for another organization in Cambodia. He wanted to help at the scene of this accident and, walk back to where these buses were in this tangled mess. And, basically, he was pulling dead bodies out of one of the buses. And I realized, I had to do something. And so I brought this big first aid kit that all EWB volunteers are given in their pre-deployment training, along with, trying to remember my first aid training. And I walked towards the scene. And one of the men that was pulled out of one of the buses was put in front of me. Or, I was there. And there was a crowd of about 50 locals gathered around, in a circle, looking on, at me with my first aid kit. And it wasn't just me, I have to say. There was also another Cambodian man who was speaking broken English to me. And we were conferring about, what little we knew. We were trying to plan what we should do with this broken, moaning man with a compound fracture in his arm, something very wrong with his leg, which I was very hesitant to try to sort of move. And, I would have had to sort of cut his pants to figure out exactly what was going on. I left that one, but I thought that I could do something about his arm. It was covered in blood. I now that I'm telling the story, remember, this is the third time I am recording this episode. And now on the third telling, finally I'm remembering more details, because I was almost paralyzed myself with panic, because I thought he was dying in front of me, and I was like, holy shit, what can I do to stop that, with only just my little first aid training, my little first aid kit. But now I remember on the third telling that there was this flap of skin, essentially the whole of the top of his hand had been cut or sliced, and there was holding on by a little bit at the back there, and I could see into his hand, like just flesh, right? That was what greeted me, along with when I ripped out all the things out of my first aid kit, and I was following the procedure that I thought I should follow. So that included getting the disinfectant swab, so I happily ripped it out of its sachet, and I put it on my finger. It was on my, sort of my, like on here, and I was trying to wipe the blood and other debris off of his arm, and I because it was underneath his arm, I couldn't see properly, and then I just found my finger going into it was literally the second knuckle that my finger just went into his arm. That didn't do wonders for my state of panic. Anyway, so I was like, okay, all right, I'm just going to abandon trying to disinfect things. Let's just try and stop the goddamn bleeding. And maybe, in the standard sort of first aid kit, you guys might have come across that big triangular pad bandage with, a long, meters long bit of gauze attached to it, wrapped around. And you might have gone through your head, what kind of an accident, what kind of a situation is going to need me to use that? And that was what was in front of me. So this guy, so I took that and I put it on and I did my best to sort of wrap it around. And we got to a point where, it looked like I'd, at least had dealt with that puncture, right? And going on with all of this guy was moaning initially, and that was a good sign. Obviously he was beside himself with pain, but then he stopped making sound, and that took my panic to another level, and I was sort of preparing myself to be confronted with a man who had died in front of me. Another part of this was that, from the crowd around me, like I realized, because it was his arm was broken, right? So I was like, well, shit, we better splint the thing. So I grabbed a stick, I looked around me and I was looking for a stick. And I found one that, looked like if I could break it in half, it could be used as a splint. And I didn't end up breaking. I think I just gave it to one of the locals standing there. I waved it at him, break it, and he did. And I got 2 sticks back, and I put them on either side of his arm, and that was another bandage to wrap it around. And I felt like I'd done the right thing, It's like, oh, I fixed that one. And other parts of the chaos around were, occasionally there would be these so-called ambulances. They weren't ambulances in the way that we think of ambulances. There were vans. And in the back was a bunch of broken glass, a bunch of blood smeared on the stretcher, right? The stretcher. And it wasn't a stretcher in the way that, with strapping and nicely secured and all this stuff. It comes out with legs. No, it was just a piece of, a couple of metal bars and something struck between it. I think this one was actually padded somehow, Anyway, so eventually I think one of these vans came along, and we managed, there was like a squabble, for who would get in which one, and there were people, able to get themselves into them, so there wasn't it wasn't necessarily right that they were the ones that got in ahead of others, like the guy I had treated. Anyway, so in the meantime, he'd sort of somehow come back to life and he started moaning and crying again. Someone had gotten his mobile phone out of his pocket and called the last called number, which happened to be a family member back in Vietnam. So they were informed, that he was being taken, to a hospital somewhere in Phnom Penh. And the phone, I think, was shoved back in his pocket. And he'd started moaning again. And we a bunch of us managed to get him after fighting off others, into the back of one of these vans. And it was like, hope you don't die, hope you make it, and good luck anyway at the hospital where you end up. And that's not the end of it. So there is a vast gulf between the rich and the poor in Cambodia. What you will see, and so what I've got, I might put this in later, is a video from the Riverside Road in Phnom Penh. And I'm just counting all of the luxury SUVs that drive along the road. And I have never in my life, and I came to Cambodia from Brisbane, okay, during a gas boom. So there were a hell of a lot of rich people getting around Brisbane. This is the capital of the state of Queensland on the east coast of Australia. I have never even there seen such a concentration of luxury cars as I did in Cambodia. And so what did we see at the scene of this horrific head-on collision between a Vietnamese tourist bus or a transit bus and a local bus, with dead bodies being pulled out of these buses? What we saw was a convoy of 5 or so Range Rover Sports driving by this traffic jam along the side of the road, creeping up the side, trying to, get past people. And they calmly drove by the scene of this crash. They didn't get out. There's us here, us foreigners, doing what they can with their shitty little first aid kit and their shitty little bandages, putting their fingers in someone's arm trying to clean out a wound. No, they just sat there, tried to skirt past the scene of the accident with their Range Rover Sports. They're purchased with an inexplicable amount of money that they'd somehow accumulated in the faces of one of the poorest populations in the world. So that's why I'm traumatized. So what else can I cover off from Cambodia? Oh, okay. So also on this little agenda of mine, for your benefit, I will put it back up. So we've covered the dictator, we've covered evictions, we've covered the bus crash, we've covered the rich versus poor divide. Infrahumanization, there's a funny word. So my first degree was psychology. And so I've had this as a skill set and a way to explain the world, basically an understanding of human nature with me throughout my career. And I have lent on it. It's probably I think it's probably helped a lot. An example of how dehumanization and integrative review. There we go. We can get the ResearchGate version. So I'm going down to a diagram. Here's the diagram. So what Nick and others, and it's kind of common sense like a lot of psychology, what they observe is that it's easy to do bad things to people when you don't consider them to be human. And he contends that there's a couple of continua that you can put people on to understand this phenomenon. So one continuum goes between human uniqueness and animalistic dehumanization, and another continuum goes between human nature and mechanistic dehumanization. So he has, through his research, offered some useful understanding, I believe. So you may find it difficult to identify with someone who is not from where you're from. This is what psychologists refer to as sort of the in-group and out-group effect. And his position is that othering people or assigning them to an out-group can occur via these mechanisms of animalistic dehumanization and mechanistic dehumanization. So those from where you're from or from your in-group, you might be more likely to consider them as having civility, being refined, having moral sensibility. I'm going across the top here. Using rationality and logic, and being mature. But those from an out-group on this continuum, Nick Haslam? Yeah, I think that's his surname. Those from an out-group on this human uniqueness to animalistic dehumanization continuum, he says that those from an out-group we may, instead of seeing them as being civil, believe that they have a lack of culture, believe that they are of a more coarse nature, thinking that they are, instead of having moral sensibility, rather thinking that those from an out-group have amorality or a lack of self-restraint, and that instead of being rational and logical, that they are often, irrational and are driven by instincts. Speaking to the animalistic, dehumanization, and last of all, that they are more childlike, rather than being mature. So about this childishness thing. So when I was in Cambodia, the place is awash in NGOs of all sorts. And one of them that disturbed me a bit was called Ragamuffin. And it was, to help understand why I had a problem with it, is have in the back of your mind that I have a degree in psychology, and I had a sensitivity to what a registered psychologist or a clinical psychologist would do when confronted with a traumatized population, which you can understand the Cambodian population was, because it had been through, a genocide that wiped out a quarter of its population, had been indiscriminately bombed without, explanation by a foreign power for years, supposedly in a war with its neighbor, but not, without there being formally declared a war with Cambodia. Genuinely a population riven with post-traumatic stress disorder. So a clinical psychologist and someone, at least me, not being a clinical psychologist, is important to say, not a registered practitioner, nevertheless with someone understanding of what such an individual might do when confronted with a traumatized population like this. They would, one would hope, implement world-class, evidence-based psychotherapy interventions. Yet what Ragamuffin, this NGO, was doing was using art therapy, which does not have a basis in evidence for being effective, I'm sorry to say. And on top of that, it had a name which spoke to animalistic dehumanization, because it was called Ragamuffin, which relates to a toy from childhood. Does this name speak to thinking of the Cambodian population as being mature and having human uniqueness? I put it to you that it does not. There's something else to say about Ragamuffin. And this, again, is to speak to the trauma and the terror and the guilt that began to accumulate in this interesting international career that I've had, is in its well-meaning advocacy efforts on behalf of and with those living in urban poor settlements across Phnom Penh. Samakum Tieng Tanaut worked with some of the most infamous and well-known local Cambodians fighting unfair evictions from urban poor settlements across the city. There was this woman, an incredibly dynamic, powerful, fierce woman who, grew up and sort of lived in one of these urban poor settlements in the city. And she was a part of a broader collective across several of these settlements, working together to fight for justice. And of course, STT, or Samakong Tieng Tanaut, sought to support her and provide advice and to a megaphone. However, things crossed the line, in my view, when in some of the advocacy work and in fighting the government, something that STT and others as a collective, the result of what they did was that several of these women were put in prison. And of course, parallel to that, what happened was that the foreign NGO workers from, in my case, Australia, and the leader from Finland, and several other organizations, there were people from the UK. Were we put in prison? No. And also it has to be said that I actually wasn't directly involved in whatever the confrontations with the police and government were that these women, through their protesting did, I wasn't at the scene where they were arrested. I wasn't part of provoking the government officials to lead them to imprison these women. Because I was as GIS people always are, as Geospatial always are, I was sitting in the office worrying about spreadsheets and a database. And it was news to me that the organization that I was funded by Engineers Without Borders Australia to volunteer for was militant enough to be at the scene, as it were, where through the actions in concert with these women, they had engaged in, locals ended up arrested and put in prison. And so I will never forget, there was this all hands on deck kind of meeting where this female, almost equally militant female leader from Finland, who was a bit of a force of nature herself, basically laid it all out for us about the situation that STT had found itself involved with, where through their actions, some local women had been put in prison. And I remember sitting up the back, and I was sort of I was concerned and appalled, really, that now it appeared that STT had to work along with other organizations to get these women out of prison. And in the course of talking about the concern and distress that this may have caused to employees of the NGO, this Finnish leader mentioned Ragamuffin. Because they were quite well known, apparently, around, the NGO world, and respected, funnily enough, despite not offering evidence-based trauma interventions. And the look that must have gone across my face when Ragamuffin was mentioned by this, this leader, as a credible way for NGO employees to recover if they were feeling distressed. Because it was at that time that I had been challenging Ragamuffin's involvement in a TEDx event in Phnom Penh, because I was being a eager little volunteer and generally participating in, in life, in the city. So I was a volunteer with TEDx, and it was through that I came to be because Ragamuffin were going to present about their work. And when I found out about what, how they weren't offering evidence-based trauma interventions, I took a stand. And that led to a bit of a showdown between me and one of the TEDx organizers and the leadership of Ragamuffin, where I was accused by one of the Ragamuffin founders of representing drug companies, of all things. I was just like some volunteer, who happened to know what would be preferable, what we should all work towards, which is to bring the best trauma recovery therapy the world has to offer to this hapless population, the victim of decades-long various traumas from incompetent internal leaders and uncaring, dispassionate, disconnected external country leaders. Anyhow, so I just wanted to add that I honestly, I'm struggling to remember exactly the details because, again, it was all at arm's length for me. I was an office worker. This was something that was on the leader of STT, given that she was, heavily involved with the actions which led to these women being in prison. But from what I can recall, they were in prison for basically a month. And then, through significant concerted, publicized political advocacy action, one by one, these women were extracted from prison. But I hope it was a lesson. It taught these organizations a lesson that, yes, you can advocate, but it's a very bad look to take it as far as locals from the settlements and the communities you're hoping to improve life for. In fact, they end up in prison and you do not. So that also is why an accumulation of trauma began and guilt began in Cambodia. Anyway, so then moving on to the human nature to mechanistic dehumanization continuum. On the human nature side, emotional responsiveness is thought of as being part of human nature, along with interpersonal warmth, cognitive openness, agency and individuality, and lastly, depth. On the mechanistic dehumanization side is inertness instead of emotional responsiveness, coldness instead of interpersonal warmth, rigidity instead of cognitive openness, passivity and fungibility instead of agency and individuality, and lastly, superficiality instead of depth. So this framework for understanding dehumanization and infrahumanization was really powerful for me for understanding how those from out groups, how those not from where you're from, can be perceived if you're not careful. You might, without intending to, whilst thinking of yourself as being cognitively open, as having interpersonal warmth, one may, if one isn't careful, because you're confronted as a foreigner with those who are not from where you're from, may think of those outsiders as being inert, cold, rigid, passive, superficial, or as lacking in culture, as being coarse, as being amoral, as having no self-restraint, as being irrational, instinct-driven, and childlike. So I wanted to say that a part of the solution that began to form for me using my psychology degree with the stimuli that Cambodia offered me was to read this publication from Nick and to confront the world with this framework as a mechanism to avoid dehumanizing and infrahumanizing those who came across my path from outgroups from around the world. Infrahumanization is a term I've used a few times, and it's basically a less severe form of dehumanization. The key one is considering someone from an outgroup as being coarse. So what that means is that, yes, you might anticipate that an outgroup member has emotions, but you might only anticipate that they have coarse emotions like, disgust, elation, the more severe ones. But the milder ones, speaking to a more refined experience in the world, you might withhold anticipation of those more refined emotions and only expect those from your in-group members. You may expect only unrefined emotions, coarse emotions from out-group members. You might not even expect out-group members to have a sense of humor. It might be a shock to you that there's stand-up comedy, you know, amongst Cambodians, enjoyed solely by an audience of Cambodians, with the comedian being a Cambodian. This is the effect of infrahumanization. And because it's more subtle, it's maybe more powerful and more common. So, yeah, it's been an hour. I've done one country. There's more. I think I'll pause there. At least it's a point to pause, I think, because it's a high note, or it's a note to do with solutions and therefore healing. And this, as I said from the start, is the focus, is the approach I'm taking. The experience I've had, and that not just I have had, several people have had, invites other approaches than solutions. I understand it. I'm speaking to those others who have had this experience. I understand it. If you find that this experience invites lifelong self-punishment, lifelong guilt, I understand it. If you enter into a tailspin of self-destruction, or I don't endorse it, but I can understand if you may feel revengeful tendencies. I am lucky that I am in a place with the social, emotional, and financial capital at present to take a solutions-based approach and to experience the healing for myself and others that this may offer. I again say how much I respect the agency of Fatima, the Afghan refugee, basically, who was deeply affected by the trauma of war in her beautiful country. I respect the agency that she has displayed in overcoming this trauma to the degree that she was able to become a New York Times journalist and speak and to testify in the Kabul Falling podcast, such that she may enable the solutions and the healing that others hearing what she said may achieve or may work to achieve, such as myself. So thank you, Fatima, for your display of agency.